Welcome to the PA Books Podcast. PA Books is a production of PCN, the Pennsylvania Cable Network. This program features interviews with authors of books on Pennsylvania people, history, sports, business, nature, and politics. We hope you enjoy this podcast. This week on PA Books, Beverly Tomek, author of Slavery and Abolition in Pennsylvania.
Beverly Tomek is the author of Slavery and Abolition in Pennsylvania. Why did you write this book?
Well, the simple answer is the PHA series asked me to cover the topic, but what really led me there was my previous work in abolition, anti-slavery, all the various movements in Pennsylvania. And we wanted a synthesis.
So you mentioned the PHA, the Pennsylvania Historical Association.
Yes.
How does this fit into their series?
Well, we kind of revamped the series a few years ago, and we made a partnership with Temple to publish the books. And so then we took some of the best books from the past in the series and reissued them, redid them to fit Temple's guidelines. And this is the second completely new one in the series that we've done. And the whole point of that series is to have a synthesis, which would give you an overview of a topic, give you enough to, go look further if you want to know more about a specific angle, but they're not, by any means a tome, comprehensive. So we thought it was a good point to kind of synthesize where abolition scholarship is today. And it felt like the right venue for it.
Now, you write in the book that much of the story of Northern slavery remains hidden. Why?
Well, a big part of it is it's not like, you go to Georgia, Alabama, even Texas, and you see plantations. Up here you don't, right? Slavery was a different nature up here. So there aren't the kind of visible landmarks. There's also the mythology. So when I went into grad school, I live in Texas, I've always lived there, but I've been fascinated by Quakers and anti-slavery, and I even went into it naively as a grad student. Pennsylvania, yeah, good guys, they never had slavery, they had people fighting against it, and it was, early in grad school, but still grad school, where I realized, holy cow, yeah, they did. That's why they had the first abolition. So there's that myth, though, that's out there in the world that abolition it sort of becomes the legacy of what is Pennsylvania early history, and slavery not so much. And so, in the last decade or so, more people are covering that and putting it together, because it makes sense, right? You have slavery, which leads to abolition, which then, once it's abolished in the state, the movement becomes to go national. But there was no national until they took care of local, and it all fits together.
When did enslaved Africans first come to the Mid-Atlantic area?
Oh, very early. Let's see. There's all that hubbub about the 1619 Project, talking about slavery coming in the South and it being a thing. It wasn't much past that it's in the Mid-Atlantic. Slavery built the Mid-Atlantic, built Pennsylvania, built all of these states, or what would become states. So enslaved labor built the foundation, even of Pennsylvania.
How significant was Philadelphia as a slave trade port?
It was a major port. One point I found in a lot of the sources that, until I really sat and thought about it, it didn't register. But when you think about it, it kind of affects how you see things. And that is, trading enslaved human beings, even in Philadelphia, was no different than trading any other good, in the sense of there was no stigma to it. There was no feeling of that being ill-gotten gains when you got money from selling humans. It was just another trading good. There's a picture, I believe, that I have in the book of one of the main trading houses. You could go be having a meal while they auction humans. And that even happened in Philly, unfortunately.
Now, you say that the North benefited from a system of human bondage that was even more varied and complex than the slavery in the South. What were some of the differences between the two forms of slavery?
Yes. Well, when we think of the South, and again, even within the South, it's complex, but typically in the South, you've got bigger holdings and you've got task system where you have a whole group of enslaved people and you say, okay, take care of 10 bushels of whatever your crop is. And if you finish that at the end of the day, you can have a little free time. And then you have the gang system where you have an overseer standing over and rows of people working in the fields. Up here, it's not quite like that. Enslaved people lived in the house, usually with I say quote owner because I don't like the idea that people owned people, but they lived in the same quarters. They did housework. They did very highly skilled work, blacksmithing, chimney sweeping, all kinds of things that are we just today think of as jobs. We don't think of that as, an enslaved job, whereas it's easy to think of agriculture, or at least Southern, as enslaved work. Well, up here there was agriculture, but it was more small scale. There was also the iron industry. That was a major industry to employ enslaved workers. So industry, all kinds of stuff.
How did the iron industry become a major user of slave labor?
Well, just like how South Carolina became a major grower of rice, enslaved people brought certain skills that they had with them, and then as the skills or things develop that you need iron, you need to know how to make it. They had some knowledge from Africa, and their knowledge got pulled into how to make it grow and happen as an industry, and so from there, they were sort of foundational to it.
Were the enslaved Africans who were brought into the Philadelphia area, were they specifically chosen for skills or from certain regions of West Africa?
In some cases, and in a lot of cases, they were what they call seasoned, first in the Caribbean or Central or South America and the islands. So they had had some degree of learning the language, for example. There are some cases where people would bring in enslaved people from different regions just so they don't right away kind of form bonds that would, I guess, make them more apt to resist, if you will. But I did find cases of, merchants talking back and forth and knowing that this person has certain skills. So, yes, I need someone that can do that. So then they market the people.
Was this development of slavery in Pennsylvania, had this been part of the English culture going back further, or was it something that was being developed during the colonial era itself?
Slavery as we know it or think about it historically, there's a history of it forever. But what it became here is developing the colonial era because it becomes a race-based chattel thing that's developing along with colonization of the New World, if you want to call it that. So it's forming, it's growing, it's developing. They're having to come up with systems to codify what does slavery mean, what are the rules of slavery. That's all developing as the colonies are developing. And it develops a little bit different in each different colony to some extent.
Now, Pennsylvania as a colony had different groups of religious believers and different ethnic groups. Did slave owning break down on sectarian or ethnic lines?
Sadly, I wanted to find that Quakers never owned slaves, and no, they all pretty much did. But the one ethnic area that would be, I would say, less apt to own enslaved people were Germans. And some of the sources I found while working on this book, they kind of talk about why. Is it because the humanitarian aspect? Are they more humanitarian? Are they averse to owning people? And one source said, no, not really. It was almost more a clannishness of their own, just sticking with, quote, their own kind, just other Germans. So I'm not sure the extent that was altruistic or not approving of ownership, or the extent to which it was that, just sticking in their own enclaves. But yeah, Germans were the ones. And the Germantown petition, we always think of it, or I used to, and a lot of us do, as a Quaker thing or, something to do with Society of Friends. But the sources I was looking at working on this, a few of them pointed out Yeah, they had become Quakers. They were part of the Quaker thing, but it was really more the German influence that led them to write that protest. So the German part was significant.
You mentioned earlier that Pennsylvania was in many ways built by this enslaved labor and some of the skills. How did it impact institutions like financial institutions and the establishment of businesses?
Greatly, because some of the people who were trading in human lives then used that money to invest in other endeavors. And so that money became foundational to other businesses. And also, transportation businesses, other things that grew. They grew because of capital acquired through the use of enslaved labor.
Now, one of those figures was Robert Morris, who's one of the more prominent figures of the American Revolution, the founder of the Bank of North America. What role does slavery play in his wealth?
He was one of the ones trading people, and that money becomes money he can then use to invest. And so that's the foundation of what he had. Same with Benjamin Chew, which is another one that becomes vastly wealthy. Multiple holdings of land, and on all the different homesteads and land holdings, he has humans working there.
You mentioned earlier about I think you were talking about the London Coffee House in Philadelphia, yes, where slave auctions were taking place. If we had walked into a place like that, what would it have looked like?
It would have looked like just people sitting at tables talking. Sometimes they're more sitting I don't know if you're familiar with an auction today, like going to an auction where I live. You just go in and you all sit around and they put, in our case, cattle or horses up and you bid. There was some of that, but the London one, the ones in town, that's what blew my mind. It's people sitting at tables, visiting with their friends, watching the people that are brought up, put for sale, deciding, oh yeah, I'll bid for that one. And like it's not even a big deal in their mind that they're deciding the fate of another person.
Now, during this time period, there were also indentured servants coming from Europe. Was there a relationship between the use of indentured servants versus the use of enslaved labor?
Yes. So actually, a lot of the people who ended up owning enslaved people started out with indentured servants. And a lot of sources kind of show that was really their preference. That it was easier, right? It's a system that they've already got developed. They already know more about how to do that from England, and they felt more comfortable. They looked similar, They liked that better. But here's the problem with indentured servants. You just get them, first of all, they've got a contract that protects them to some extent. Yes, they're worked very hard. I'm not downplaying that. But there is a contract, and that contract says how long they will remain in that position. So you get them trained up really well, they're doing what you need, and then boom, their term is over. So there's that. There's also, when the various wars would come about, the indentured servants would be enticed away to go help fight the war, and so then you've lost your labor force. So enslaved people, you didn't have to deal with either one of those problems. Also, indentured servants, when their time is up, you owe them at least some freedom dues, right, to go start out. Well, with enslaved people, you'll never have that. So the preference at first was indentured servants, but that became problematic, securing those servants. So enslaved people were brought in to fill the void, and then they learned, this works out. It's cheaper, even more to our advantage, to make money using enslaved people.
How did slavery move through Pennsylvania as settlers continued to move out from Philadelphia?
It went westward with them. Now, it's in pockets. You've got more of the iron area. You're going to have more enslaved people, and the south, going southeast to southwest. So it fanned outward with settlement. But again, it just depended to some extent on what the settlers are doing when they get to their final destination in terms of how many enslaved people they took.
So as slavery is developing from the early years in the colonial area. How did they develop codes to govern the behavior of enslaved people?
That was part of the trick, right? When you're working with indentured servants, you've already got codes because you're bringing them with you from the homeland. When it comes to enslaved people, you've got to build a new system. So they start to find ways to maintain their control as tightly as possible. Then you end up, for whatever reason, you have, small population of free black people, and then that population grows. So then you also have the complicated issue of working out how to keep enslaved people and free black people apart. So a lot of the laws that they make, though, end up affecting both enslaved and free blacks. For example, you can't be out past a certain time of day, or if you are out, you better have your freedom papers to show that it's okay to be out. That'll become a big deal as you get closer to the Civil War, because if you're born free and your mom was born free, you don't have freedom papers. So that really perpetuates this racial divide that is the U.S., right? And those laws, they start out, I guess good news for Pennsylvania, if you will, is that Virginia grapples with a lot of the issues first. So that's where you get laws like a person follows the status of their mother. So if your mother's enslaved, you're born into slavery. Well, Pennsylvania, uses that too. They all end up, all the colonies do. But all these codes are what create this very unique U.S.-based slavery.
Now, one of the figures you talk about in the book is Cuff Dix. Who was he?
Cuff Dix was, he was a guy who was determined to be free. I think that's a good way to describe him. I mean, don't get me wrong, most enslaved people were determined to be free. He happens to be one we have a historical record of. So he runs away, and he gets caught, and he runs away again, and at one point, the master or owner, he pierces his ear, and then there's a different point where he puts this collar on him, but he still keeps going. And the truth is, we're not absolutely sure how his life ended, but from what I gather, or what I presume based on the historical evidence and where the ads for him stop, is I suspect he was one who ends up going to fight with the British in the Revolution. But I don't know, I get a kick out of him. I admire him. He wasn't going to stop. And the more they would catch him, the more determined he was that he was going to be free.
One of the terms you use in the book is term slaves. What did that mean?
Okay, that's one that I just really started using while writing this, because I hadn't really thought about it before. But the Gradual Abolition Act, it frees people born after a certain date, but they're not free till they're grown. So they are enslaved during that time. So they're a term slave. So that's kind of, that's one of the limitations of that act, because it is gradual. And if you think about it, in our day and age, to be 30, that's, what do they say, the new 20. You're still young. Back then, you weren't so much. And by the time you actually gain that freedom, you've worn yourself out because you had to. So you're free, but your best resources have been spent, so to speak.
Now, earlier you talked about the Quakers and their later role in the anti-slavery movement. Can you talk a little bit about how anti-slavery sentiment evolved within the Society of Friends?
Sure. I think I see parallels, with that in any great conscious movement. You get first the ones who stop and really think about it. You get the Benjamin Lays of the world. And they think about, slavery's wrong, I got to do something. So Benjamin Lay, he observes slavery and what it looks like in the Caribbean, and he comes up and he makes it his mission. He's going to tell people this is a bad thing, we don't need to do this. Well, what happens when you're sort of a pioneer of any conscious movement? You're the weirdo, right? So at first people don't really want to listen. Now he does do some extreme measures to get his message across. He at one point he kidnaps a slave owner's child, and he's got the child. The slave owner's panicking, my child's gone. And after a while, he says, he just had him, I think a few days, but maybe it was a couple days. I don't remember how long he had the child, but he's like, see how that felt? That's what you do to people all the time. Well, but then, how does that look? That makes him look a little crazy, I guess. Another thing he does is he hollows out a Bible, and he takes, I think it's a sheep blood or whatever it is that he can fill with pokeberry juice, which is red. It looks like blood. And he puts it in the Bible, closes it, comes to church, or to meeting, not church, to meeting, and he's got a sword, and that's a big no-no for Quakers. And he stands up and he stabs the Bible with the sword, and the juice squirts out. And, people are covered by fake blood. Again, radical. You can decide to get a message out being radical, or you can, be a little more, I guess, respectable, like John Woolman. So John Woolman writes a number of works, and he's more accepted by the establishment because of how he approaches it. But what really matters here is you've got people of all different mindsets, one or two here and there, sparks of light, bringing this idea out and not shutting up and pursuing it however they pursue it. I would argue it takes both. It takes the radical and the calmer elements. And they push, and you just get one or two more, and they add to it, and one or two more. And eventually, within the society of friends, you get enough people saying, hey, come on, no, to where that starts to be a big enough factor that even those who continue to have economic interest in selling humans or benefiting from enslaved labor, little by little, they kind of have to accept, all right, true, it's not a good thing. So then they, being the friends, they decide reluctantly, stop buying more people, stop importing, and then, emancipation. And then that is mirrored in Pennsylvania society. It's just like that in steps. They stop by, first you stop the trade, and then you can end slavery.
Was there something similar going on within other faiths, or was it really just the Society of Friends where this anti-slavery movement was growing?
They're the pioneers. They're the first. Later, you'll get the Methodist, and we'll talk more about that later. But later, you get the Methodists, who they're another group or a sect that is opposed, but that is not. It doesn't become as systematic or endemic in the movement here as the Quaker movement.
Was there anything in the beliefs of the Quakers that made them perhaps more prone to oppose slavery?
There are, and that's what kind of flummoxes me a little bit about the ones who hang on to it for as long as they do. I know it's cold hard cash, right? But what I love about the Quaker faith, and I still do, is the belief that every one of us has an inner light. And that inner light, if you want to call it the Holy Spirit, it's more like really the inner light can speak to the Holy Spirit can speak to the inner light. And any of us, even I tell my students, even women, even people of color, anyone can be reached by this light. So then when you believe that, it kind of makes it harder to think it's okay to own groups of people and sell their children and do all the horrible things that come with enslavement.
You'd mentioned earlier the Germantown petition, and Francis Daniel Pastorius was one of the key figures at that time. Who was he?
He was one of those Germans that I had mentioned who comes over, and he's part of, so the Germans within the settlement that becomes Germantown, they create their little area, their little part of the settlement, and he's one of the leaders of that, and they're just one of the first to really kind of go against slavery. Now, if you really look at the Germantown petition, there's some complexity there. I don't know if you got to see or if you looked at it, but there is that slavery is wrong. There's also that by bringing people into this new world and owning them and treating them the way we do, we're making God unhappy, so God might smite us or, otherwise get retribution. We're also bringing people into this settlement, into our what becomes state, under conditions that are not friendly. And so wouldn't we at any moment, if we were in such a situation, try to rise up and fight back and perhaps kill our captors? Those are the kind of sentiments in there. So you see self-interest along with moral qualms, if you will. I just think that's so complex, and I think that's important for the whole abolition movement, whether we're talking the early period or we're going all the way up to the Civil War. What really makes the whole thing take off in broader society is when you can get self-interest in there. And so Pastorius is one of the first, he and his partners writing the petition, they're one of the first because they're talking about, yes, it's wrong, but also look, think, be logical. What could happen to us if this continues? And that's a thread that we'll see all the way to the Civil War.
How did enslaved people resist their condition?
Well, a million ways. My students usually get kind of frustrated, and they want to ask things like, well, why didn't they fight back? And the answer is they did fight back. Now, there are some who fought back, like, poisoning masters or, well, Nat Turner, but that's not Pennsylvania. But that's not practical, though. That's really not. What is that going to do in a society that is built upon a system of enslavement and protecting slavery? That kind of resistance is dangerous. So the real resistance, what I really think most of us would probably do if we found ourselves in a condition of enslavement tomorrow, is the day-to-day. Working slower where the master doesn't make as much money. Breaking tools that are essential to the job, then that costs the master money. Feigning illness today, if you can get away with it, that would probably be hit or miss. Running away is a big one. And running away is going to become key in Pennsylvania's role in bigger abolition, like beyond the state. So running away, I think, is it's an important one. And then you get armed resistance, right? The cover of the book has some armed resistance that I think is pretty interesting. But it's the whole gamut. And what I tell my students, and it applies to the people I learned about while researching this book, is every one of us has a different personality, and our personality would influence greatly how we react to any kind of condition, from including enslavement.
Now, you mentioned in the book the Pinkster Festival. What was that?
That's where enslaved, and then later some free black people also can participate, but it's in Philly, and they get together and they party and they have fun and they have mock elections. And you and I may think, well, what good did that do? What are they electing? Well, because it's just letting off steam, and it's creating their own version of things they see in the bigger world. And it scared the heck out of some white people because they did not want any kind of congregation, any kind of getting together. And they thought that it sort of fostered more radical moves for independence.
Now, another figure you talk about in the book is Anthony Benezet. Who was he?
He was an amazing person. Most people think of him as a teacher, and he was a teacher. After reading all of his stuff again, I had read most of his stuff for previous work I had done, but I read it all again for this, and I'm really convinced more than ever he's the first. I'm going to say he was a historian because he was trying to seriously, honestly chronicle life in Africa and what it was like in Africa. Now, why he was doing that is he was trying to sort of counter stereotypes that were very prevalent at his time, that, people of African descent, they came from uncivilized places, so we're doing them favors by bringing them here and civilizing them. And he wrote about Africa in ways that showed, no, we're not. Their societies are just as varied. They have just as much going for them in a lot of ways, and we're ripping people out of them. And his work is just wonderful. It's beautiful because he's trying to, of course, fight for abolition. He's also trying to educate. People think of him as someone who educated black children. he educated everybody who would read his stuff. He was trying to educate us all and show us all better.
How did the American Revolution affect slavery in Pennsylvania?
The American Revolution, some people argue, is sort of like the nail in the coffin for slavery in Pennsylvania. And that's a fair assessment, because it brings about all kinds of phrases and intellectual thoughts in the world that enslaved people are able to turn around and use to their benefit. For example, the idea that we're all created equal. Well, then you get Black Americans, not just in Pennsylvania, but throughout, Massachusetts, Pennsylvania, this northern part of the world, saying, oh, hi, I would like some of that equality. You said we're all equal, so I'm a person too. So you get petitions, but you also get an opportunity to participate in the war, to show your equality, to fight for, this what's going to be a new nation. And then, so when you do that and you fight for this new nation, it gives you an opportunity to say, well, I fought too. I think of James Forten, right? He was fighting, he was on a ship, and he gets captured by the British. And they like him, and they say, why don't you come live with us? We'll give you all kinds of support, and you can get away from this place where, there's slavery. And he says, no, I'm going to help build this country. And he becomes one of the wealthiest Americans of his time. So it's opportunity. And you also, speaking of opportunity, get situations where people will maybe promise someone, okay, I'll tell my enslaved person, hey, if you come fight, I'll let you be free later. And then there you go, there's an obligation. So people gain their freedom that way.
Now, in 1780, the Pennsylvania legislature passed the Gradual Abolition Act. What did it do?
It freed the next generation, would be a way to say it. So if you're born after the date of passage, when you reach, it's different birth dates if you're a man or a woman, but when you reach the age of emancipation, you will be free. You will no longer be enslaved. One of my colleagues, though, pointed out to me that there are so many loopholes in there, that the whole term slave thing. So if during that period while you're still enslaved, yes, you're going to be free, but you have a child, that child's born in slavery. So then they have term slavery. So that cycle could perpetuate, and it did for many years. So I don't want to be one of the people that says, small change isn't good enough. Heck no, small change is good. That was something, but it had serious limitations.
So for term slaves who would have been freed at 28 years old, did the slave owners decide to sell them outside of the state?
Unfortunately, some did, more than we would want to think did. Also, some took pregnant enslaved women out of the state to have children so that those children would not gain freedom at any point. If there was a loophole, someone found it.
How did term slavery affect families? You often would have people who would be enslaved for life if they were born before March 1st, 1780, and then others who were not. And once they gained their freedom, would they leave their families? What kind of connection did they have then?
That's tricky, because if you want to stay near your family, it does limit your mobility, right? And a lot of people, not just in Pennsylvania, but other states, would end up choosing to be near their family in ways that limited their own opportunities. So it did. It limited a lot of people.
Was the Gradual Abolition Act seen as a significant step in its own time?
It's seen as radical in its own time. There are people so after the act passes, the next legislative cycle, the next group of people who are voted in, start trying to repeal it. It's kind of like the Health Care Act today, right? You got people immediately trying to come in and change it and repeal it and do away with it. Now, they don't manage to, but there is that effort from the get-go.
How did slave owners try to defy the provisions in the act?
They would, first of all, simply not register enslaved people that they had kept. There were fines for that, and there were penalties, but to some people it was worth the risk, and I'm pretty sure a lot of people got away with it. Others would, like you said a while ago, sell enslaved, or, before they could gain their freedom, sell them. And then others would make sure that women had babies, like take them to Virginia to have the baby. Because some people, or Maryland, some people who maybe, like Benjamin Chew, he's, we think of him as a Philadelphian. His main home is Philadelphia, but he's got plantations in other areas, so they can easily move where people are having their children.
Did the Gradual Abolition Act have any effect upon people who came from, say, Virginia or other states and brought slaves with them into Pennsylvania?
They were supposed to be able to stay 6 months, and then they would have to leave. Now, this is significant because this is when it's the capital of the nation, right? And so many of the early leaders are from Virginia or, other states where they have enslaved people, and they bring them with them. But if they're following the law, they have to rotate them out and switch them every 6 months. And amendments, though, come along eventually and take that part away, but that's a pretty big thing.
So as a growing population of term slaves achieve their freedom, do you begin to see growing free black communities in Pennsylvania?
You do, and that leads to a big backlash against abolitionists. In fact, it's with the growth of the population, that's one factor feeding the growth of the population. People in Pennsylvania who gain their freedom here by this law. Another factor is Pennsylvania gains a reputation. It becomes this beacon of liberty. So enslaved people from other states run away and head right for, particularly Philadelphia, but Pennsylvania in general. And so then that grows the free black population. And the more the population grows, the more people who resisted abolition all along anyway become resentful and scared. It's the same kind of arguments we hear today about refugees and immigrants. And so they start to resist reformers even more. The Pennsylvania Abolition Society meets and they start talking, okay, previously, maybe there were people who didn't love what we did, but they didn't really fight us, so to speak. Now we're getting called out all over the place. People are angry. What do we do? And as they start having that conversation, that was 1807 is the first writing that I actually find where they're kind of talking about stuff like that. It intensifies up to the 18-teens, which is butting up to a period in which colonization becomes a big idea. And by colonization, I mean what we call African recolonization, the idea that, all right, the only way to end slavery is to then find a way to remove people, the former slaves. And so at first it's individual people that start to say, perhaps we could create settlements in the West, Western United States, this continent. And then from there, other people start to say, what if we send them, and this quote drives me crazy, but back to Africa. People who've never been to Africa. By this point, you're talking, generations who were born here. Well, we'll send them back to Africa. These ideas percolate. They percolate it's not just racists or anti-black people who say it at first. Some abolitionists start to say it because they look around and they say, the angry people who didn't appreciate abolition are doing things like creating more restrictive laws that affect free blacks too. So what if we try to find a way to make it better for people once they're free? Let's talk about this Africa idea. The Pennsylvania Abolition Society even flirts with it. Now they ultimately say no, it's not what we want to do, it's not a good idea. But that's the kind of climate we end up with. And that backlash kind of halts further progress, because what I mean by progress is that Gradual Abolition Act was limited. So right away, abolitionists, they got it passed, but then they say, okay, that's a first step, but now what we need to do is push for ending slavery outright, freeing people now. Let's work on doing away with the gradual part. And that gets hampered in this climate. So you end up with all kinds of ideas skirting around out there. What do we do next? And Pennsylvania ends up with it starts out slow, but by the end it will become one of the strongest chapters of the American Colonization Society. And some of the people that joined that, they started out in the Pennsylvania Abolition Society. So it's a weird mix of all the people that become active in that movement.
Now, as slavery was developing in the colony of Pennsylvania, we talked about the legal codes that were developed at the time, but in order to establish slavery and enforce it, sets of beliefs and attitudes about race and ideologies were developed. Now, as slavery begins to diminish in Pennsylvania, what happens to those beliefs?
They don't diminish. They don't diminish anywhere in the U.S. There is quite a bit of anti-abolition sentiment from the beginning, and it's from a number of sources. It is because the slave system that developed was inherently built upon what we would call racism. It had to be. There had to be some mechanism to keep, think about it, John Q., average person who's not going to benefit from enslaved labor because he's just a laborer himself. How do we make sure to keep people apart? We make race a big factor. So going up towards the 1830s, that backlash I just talked about is a significant one to hamper further progress. And then you're going to end up in a climate by the 1830s of rioting. And it's sort of race-based kind of rioting, but it's also anti-abolition rioting. It's a resentment towards free blacks and towards white people who are seen as, friends of the free blacks. And that culminates into a number of events, but the one that I've written about and focused on elsewhere too is the 1838 mobbing of Pennsylvania Hall in Philadelphia. That building, so what happens is abolition starts to break into a number of branches, right? Now there's been this sort of historical argument that Pennsylvania is the home of that first wave of abolition, but by the 1830s, the heart of abolition moves to New England. That's absolutely not correct. Pennsylvania remains relevant and strong all the way through. They just morph in different ways. There were people, even in that early movement, saying that the ultimate goal is immediately ending enslavement. But if we can only get this law to pass that's gradual, then we're going to accept that and keep pushing. And that's what they're doing. And in that climate of them trying to do that, you get new groups that come about. So you've got the Pennsylvania Abolition Society, that's the original. Then you end up with the Pennsylvania Anti-Slavery Society and the Philadelphia Anti-Slavery Society and the Philadelphia Female Anti-Slavery Society. And all these groups start contributing to the movement, and they're all calling for the end of slavery, just in different ways. Well, they come together and they build what was, by all accounts, one of the grandest structures of its time. It was one of the first buildings in Philadelphia to have gas lighting, and it was amazing. There was a ground level with floors, with stores on that floor and offices for the Abolition Society, and the newspaper was housed there, the Abolition newspaper, and then on the second floor were some big meeting rooms, and then on the third floor was this amazing, what sounded just beautiful. They called it the Grand Saloon, but it was just a gigantic room, and it had this really cool ventilation system that just sounded beautiful. And it was up for 4 days, up and fully open for 4 days before it was attacked and burned to the ground. And what I tell people when I talk about these things, and I tell my students, is we like this thought that there was a group in Philadelphia that woke up and said slavery was wrong, and maybe it splintered into other groups, but they're all working together because they know slavery's wrong and they're fighting. And that happened. But that was this many people out of that many of a population, right? So that many were not in agreement, and it was those that attacked. Some accounts say that even the local police were helping with that. And why, right? People may wonder why. Well, besides the competition of jobs from free blacks, there's also this notion that Pennsylvania, and I guess it did for certain people, depended upon trade with the South to continue thriving. So we don't want to upset the South, so we don't want to be the anti-slavery Mecca.
Did free blacks in Pennsylvania have the right to vote?
They did until 1837. Now, we don't know the extent to which they took advantage of that right, but basically what happens in 1837 is the legislature meets and someone in there throws in that, because they're talking about voting restrictions for propertied people, because up to a certain point, you had to own a certain amount of property to be able to vote. So the question comes, well, we want to open the franchise and say that you can have less property and still be able to vote. And during all that discussion, someone throws in the word white. White had not been in the Constitution to that point. And it's during that's right before that mobbing of that hall, that the vote is taken away from free blacks. And so you get people like, I keep using him as an example, but he's one of my favorites, James Forten. The guy is very wealthy, and now all of a sudden he can't even vote.
Now, one of the institutions that was created in the 1780s was the Free African Society. What was that society and who created it?
That was created by Absalom Jones and Richard Allen, and it was what I would call, well, others have called a mutual aid society. So basically, what they're tackling is this. There's this notion, okay, if we have abolition and we, let people be free, those people will become a burden to society. And free blacks, like Richard Allen and Absalom Jones, have always said, no, they won't. Let me show you. So they came up with ways to ensure what we would call self-help within their own community. You know what? If someone can't get a job, we'll help them. They won't become a burden to society. So that's one of the main organizations that comes in to try to do that, to support the black community and allow for community building, community empowerment, a way to show that black Americans are just as valid as members of society as white Americans.
You mentioned Absalom Jones. Who is he?
Absalom Jones. He ends up being, I'm drawing a blank on the name of the church. He becomes one of the first independent black ministers. Richard Allen becomes the founder of Mother Bethel, Bethel Church, and the founder of the AME, the African Methodist Episcopal Church. Those two gentlemen, what they did is they were part of St. George's Church, and that was a Methodist church in Philly. And they were important members, and they kind of got more black members to join the church and to pay dues as members. And because of the growth that they brought to the church and other factors, but the growth was big, they needed to expand the church. So they helped raise money, and they helped get expansions built on the church, and not long after, they get relegated to the balcony, so to speak, literally. And when that happens, they leave the church and create independent. That's the first instance of an independent black church.
Now, in the book, you say that Reconstruction failed in Pennsylvania. Why?
Oh, Reconstruction failed in the United States, sadly. It failed in general because we meaning Americans, not just Pennsylvanians, have never yet completely opened the structure of our society for equality for black Americans. The way Reconstruction would succeed, maybe that's a way to kind of illustrate what I'm saying. Reconstruction would succeed if you truly reorder the society to accommodate the people who are now free. Step one is freeing people, and that's fantastic. It's great to not be owned, but Now what? Do you look at the structure of the government, whether it's state or federal, and make it change enough so that those people have an equal role? That's true Reconstruction. So in Pennsylvania, the Pennsylvania Abolition Society and black leaders were working towards that and trying before the backlash that I mentioned hit. Once the backlash hit, and this recapitulates in U.S. history, once the backlash hits, it's like, to some extent, giving up. The black Americans never gave up, but their allies, they fought as hard as they felt they could, but that backlash just, it slowed them down too much. It slowed them down.
So as we get into, say, the 1830s and 1840s with term slavery and with multiple generations continue to be born to, say, term slaves who then themselves are enslaved, what does slavery look like in Pennsylvania during that time period?
At that time, it's even more so small holdings, not even, well, holdings seems a weird way to put it, but working, maybe like if I own a business, I have people that are working in the business with me, or household slaves that do the, cooking, cleaning, stuff like that. So it's still continuously varied, but you still have people, they're not being auctioned, don't get me wrong. So that part's different, but they're still doing a lot of work on farms in the city.
How much risk did free blacks have during this time period of being captured and enslaved or re-enslaved if they had already been freed in the South?
So that is a big risk, especially it grows in the 1840s, and it really becomes a factor with the Fugitive Slave Law of 1850. So there's this gentleman named Martin Delany. He's one of my favorites. I don't know if you picked up on that in the book. He was born in what is now West Virginia. It was Virginia at the time, but they make their way to Pennsylvania. His mom messed up. She taught him how to read and write, and they get figured out. So she's free. The dad is still enslaved, but they end up running away, and long story, they end up in Pittsburgh. He grows up, he's educated in Pennsylvania, he's very educated. He wants to be a doctor, gets into Harvard, but the white students don't like that, and so they complain. So he is then told that he can remain and learn to be a doctor only if he'll go to Liberia, or the colony, and be a doctor there. And he says, no, I'm an American, so he won't. Anyway, he's fought all this time in various ways as an abolitionist. And when that fugitive slave law hits, he's one of the ones, he has this quote, basically, if they come for my family and cross my threshold, it's my duty to fight back. So you end up getting not only people kidnapped and taken south, but you also get more militants, I guess you will, within both the black and the abolitionist community, because at first, your only true militants were some of the black leaders. Well, as that law hits, then you get more white allies saying, okay, this is wrong. So you get Pennsylvanians who do start to step up. Not the majority, it's never the majority, but you get more who start to step up and say, no, there's right and there's legal, and I'm going to do what's right. And so you get resistance to that happening, because Martin Delany, he would have not had freedom papers. His children would have had freedom papers.
Now, you say in the book that the central part of the state, Pennsylvania, remained largely hostile to anti-slavery, in part due to economic and cultural ties to slaveholding Maryland. What were those ties, and how did they shape the culture in central Pennsylvania? You've
got families who have relatives, in those two regions that, so you go visit your cousins, right? They're your family, you know them. There's also economic ties. There's a lot of economic ties among the wealth in Philadelphia and southern products like cotton, and just the shipping of those goods. So that money's coming in. And they really feel like their future and their prosperity is at stake if the apple cart is upset, so to speak, in the South. If the South stops trading, stops sending their raw goods up here, then what? But the cultural, the family ties, that's just, I mean, borders are sort of artificial things, right? We know that today. So, yeah, that's the line. That's the Mason-Dixon line. But you've got cousins across all those lines.
Is there a record of who the last person who was legally enslaved in Pennsylvania was?
I checked with a friend who is doing work on this right now, and he couldn't come up with it either.
Well, Beverly Tomek, she is the author of Slavery and Abolition in Pennsylvania. Thank you for speaking with me.
Thank you.
Enjoying this podcast? Visit PCNTV.com to find out how to support our mission. PCN is a 501c3 nonprofit television network. You've been listening to a podcast of PA Books, a production of PCN, the Pennsylvania Cable Network. Full episodes of PA Books, as well as other PCN programs, are available to stream with the PCN app. Visit PCNTV.com or the App Store for details.